because we have a few new faces. I'm Dr. Ross. I teach this class because I like to teach this class, as is often the case of most graduate courses. And the reason that we're here and the reason that this is a required class is because we want to give you expertise before you need it. We want to make sure everybody has the expertise of people that have gone before you and failed at being an ethical scientist. So this is a great example of something that we'll talk about in class this term. And today in class, in fact, we're going to be talking about what you have been working on your tablets just now. What's the difference between, what was it, fraud and negligence? So let's see, if my phone screen was bigger, I could probably actually read what you wrote. What do you think the difference between negligence and fraud is? Don't worry that other people are still writing.
It's negligence is when you're doing something that you don't know, whereas fraud is when you're trying to benefit from something, you're just changing something to benefit from it.
Okay. And so intent, right? Others? Anything to add? Motivation, intent.
It kind of covers everything.
Yep. I think it's pretty straightforward. When you conduct misconduct, fraud is a type of misconduct. So there's negligence and there's fraud. There's I didn't know I was doing something wrong, and I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I was happy to do it anyway. And so what we're here, again, to try to do is to give you information so you don't commit negligence. You don't know what you're doing might offend somebody or actually be breaking a rule, a law, a statute. And we're trying to prevent this sort of view of science, that being intellectually dishonest is mainstream. That it's typical, it's routine scientific practice to do things that are dishonest. One of my favorite things to do when I'm preparing for a class is to go to Google Images and to find icons, pictures, drawings that are relevant to whatever topic I'm trying to have students discuss. Okay. What do you take away from this? This is the top of all of the hits when you do a Google Images search for the word scientist.
People think we're in the lab all day.
I am.
Yeah. There's a lot of, okay, so there are test tubes. So everybody that's in science works with a test tube. What else? What other trends do we have up here?
Lab coats.
Lab coat. So everyone's got a lab coat. There's some goggles.
People go mad.
So we got the mad scientist, right? In fact, that's one of the sort of subcategories here. People Google for mad scientist a lot. They Google famous scientist a lot. This also highlights another, speaking of bioethics, there's sort of a bias in these images. Who are scientists when you look at this?
Men.
Men.
And
White.
sorry.
Mostly. There are some differences up here. But when you look just at the top hits, and this really bugs me, so I'm sorry, I'm going to get on the soapbox for a second. This really bugs me because when I use Google Images to find graphics, when you maybe use Google Images to try to find graphics to amend talks, say you're going to give your project report or your thesis report, summary, defense, whatever you want to call it, maybe you go look for some clip art to stick in there. We expect you to give some graphic interest in your slides, not just all text. So be careful when you use Google Images what you pick. Don't just grab the first thing at the top of the list because that doesn't necessarily represent what science is all about. Today, what we're talking about when we talk about negligence, fraud, misconduct, is trying to prevent what apparently, according to Google Images, is a very prolific public view of the mad scientist, the crazy, deranged, whether or not it's an old white guy or not, scientist who's off operating in some secret lab doing secret things. So a main goal of talking about bioethics is to try to help us not make mistakes that are going to perpetuate these sorts of issues with the public perception of science. The public perception is one of the things we're here to manage. We'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. So integrity and misconduct. One of the first things we need to do to set the groundwork for this whole semester is figure out what it means when we talk about scientific misconduct. So there are a lot of different definitions. I encourage you to try to go to different websites, different universities, different governmental agencies. Find out what their definition of research misconduct is. So all of you probably are working with scientists here on campus who are federally funded, state funded, locally funded, some sort of grant support. Brings in money to pay for reagents, supplies, travel. So it's a good idea for you to ask your advisor, where do we get our money from? If it's BLM, NIH, NSF, whatever, go to their website and see what their definition of misconduct is. That's the first way you can make sure that you don't cross the path of your funder. Because if you break the rules of the funding agency, guess what happens?
Stop the file.
Yeah. No more money comes your way, right? I mean, that's bottom line, the most straightforward reason not to commit misconduct. It skews public perception, and then it's actually financially damaging to you and people you work with. So the initial, decades ago, definition of research misconduct, which does this sound like, the top bullet point? Does that sound more like negligence or fraud? Initially involved fabrication, falsification, plagiarism.
Fraud.
Negligence? Fraud? Between both? So which of these sounds more like negligence?
Failure to comply with federal requirements.
You're right. So if you don't know what the federal requirements are, you might run afoul of them, you might violate them unknowingly. Right? That's why we're here. And then there's the fabrication and falsification. Hopefully everybody would come down on the side of fraud in that case. That's usually intentional. Fabrication, you're making up data. Not allowed. I know, you knew that before you took this class. Falsification. What about plagiarism?
That's a bit of a gray area. Sometimes you don't know you're plagiarizing someone.
Right. And is that one of the topics for the class? Now I all of a sudden can't remember the syllabus. I know we talked about this during the class. There might be a whole period, a whole hour, we talk about plagiarism. Yeah, there's a huge gray area in plagiarism. Did you know self-plagiarism was a thing?
Yeah, that's so lame.
If you've written something and you've published it, then you can't use your own language again without attributing it to yourself or you get in trouble. But there are all sorts of issues to be concerned about in science and scientific writing and publishing particularly. So we do have a whole week on scientific publishing, peer review, the publishing process, and the fact that the journals that want to publish your work when you write it up and submit it for publication don't want you sharing that material once they have the copyright and they sort of own the material that's in the manuscript. Then it's in their best interest, and we'll talk more about this in more detail, it's in the publisher's best interest to prevent you from spreading the word and giving free PDFs of your paper to everybody, because then they can't sell it. Does that make you want to publish manuscripts more or less? Then you actually have to work to get permission. I'm giving too much information away right now. You actually have to work harder to get permission to use your own figures in other ways. So like when I teach classes, if I want to show a figure that's been published in one of my manuscripts by a journal, where's the microphone? I should I'm covering the microphone. Should technically get permission from the journal before I show it in public, because that's a violation of copyright law. I've not. Okay, now I can uncover the microphone. I mean, I made it, but once the journal publishes it and they have the copyright to it, then they make the rules. Unless you know the loopholes, which I do, and I will share them with you. So after that initial definition, then misconduct has to be fraud, became more in the forefront. It must be committed intentionally or knowingly or recklessly. So as you'd expect, I think, fraud is more heavily penalized than misconduct in most cases. That if you do it intentionally, you knew you were doing something wrong, the hammer really comes down on you. And if it's misconduct, sometimes it's a little bit more lenient penalty. Sometimes agencies are willing to work with you, sometimes not. We'll look at the details of that later in the term. Here's your chance. Maybe I should turn off the recording again. Here's your chance to tell some tales or make some guesses, maybe. If you had to guess, who is it that commits misconduct in the whole process of science, involving everybody who touches science at some point?
The person in charge.
The person in charge.
'Cause
Like
oftentimes, like
the department chair.
of the lab.
Okay.
The
The
PI.
PI, primary
Because-
investigator.
Undergrads don't really know what's happening. They just do what you tell them to do, and the results are what they are.
Mm-hmm. So grad students?
Possibly.
So you think so what you're telling me is, if I interpret correctly, that it's top down.
Yeah.
So the most likely person to commit fraud or negligence would be the PI, the faculty member, and then maybe it trickles down from there.
Fraud, up, down, negligence, from down.
So the people that are knowingly, and I have no data, we're just having a discussion. I just am curious about your opinions. I tend to agree, but that doesn't mean anything. Yeah, I think the people that, well, that brings up another question. This is perhaps the most important question for you to be able to prevent yourselves from committing misconduct of any type, negligence or fraud, is to consciously recognize why people commit these sorts of errors. So what are the motivations for committing scientific misconduct?
Get published.
To get published.
And to save time, to pay the rate.
Save time?
Yeah.
Okay, so you save time, you might self-plagiarize so you don't have to write that paragraph over again. Or find a way to rewrite it so that it's paraphrasing and not direct quoting. You've got pressure to publish because publish or perish.
Yeah, especially on time. Like if it's a field that's constantly moving, if you know that someone else is doing very similar research to yours.
Right, especially stressful.
Yeah.
Not only you're working in research and you need to get published to get the next grant, but then you find out that somebody else, and then we can talk about how you found out, whether somebody else was working on something similar to you or not. We'll talk about that later in the term as well. Then all of a sudden, man, we got to get this paper out. Do you start cutting corners? It doesn't have to be straight up fraud, not like you generate data from thin air. But you're working on a statistical analysis, and all of a sudden there's so many outliers. You think, you know what? Maybe we could just delete a few data points, raise that lower the p-value. Okay, just underneath 0.05, and then we'll send it to the journal.
Does that constitute fraud though, or is that negligent?
I don't know. Did you do it knowingly or not?
Well, yeah. If you know that like leaving a few data points, you get under 0.5. I think that's fraud.
Mm-hmm. So this is a strong statement being made here. Anybody want to take the opposite?
I mean, it could be negligence if you're not like aware of how significant that edit is.
So imagine you're a grad student or an undergraduate. Well, imagine you are a grad student. Imagine you're a grad student or an undergraduate, and the PI says that's okay. That's common practice.
Be fraud then.
On the PIs.
On the PA's part.
Right. So if the PI knows it's wrong, then that's fraud. But if he tells you and you don't ask or look into it further, then maybe it's negligence on your part.
Isn't it? And is it in most cases? This is actually more of a question. Who's prosecuted? Is it the PI that's prosecuted, or is it? So if the lab technicians are negligent, but the PI doesn't know, does the PI still get prosecuted?
Right. So it all filters back up to the person in charge. And in brief, the way it works is that the PI is responsible for everything that happens under a federally funded grant. It doesn't have to be federally funded either, but that's most common. And so the university is the legal recipient of the funds. So when I apply for a grant, it's actually California State University, Fresno that applies for the grant. I just wrote the grant. But technically the university is the applicant and the university is the recipient. And then they give me the money and I spend it according to the rules of the grant. So really, the university could get in trouble, but I get to be the scapegoat if something goes wrong on my watch. So that's why it's so important for faculty members to be hands-on, not literally, that would be unethical, but to be in the lab paying attention to what everybody's doing. And so I encourage all of you to help your mentor do that with you. To help keep them informed of what you're doing and, butt them with questions. I will defend you against them if I have to. So tell them I said that, to bother them with questions, because really it's in their best interest to know what you're doing, especially when it gets to the data analysis step, the throwing out data points, those sorts of things. To learn what are the norms in your particular discipline or in science in general about how you massage your data, whether you can, what's allowed and what's not. So your advisors are good people, of course, to help you figure those things out. As are your committee members, so use the committee members too. They're supposed to be impartial sorts of information. So if you aren't getting anywhere with your advisor or they feel very strongly and you're not willing to push it with the advisor, ask a committee member. That's one of the purposes of the committee, to be your impartial advisors. Yep. So hopefully the answer to this is pretty straightforward then. Whose responsibility is it to prevent misconduct from happening? Who? PI? Well, everybody. But yes, it's also, right, shit flows uphill in this case. So it's the PI's responsibility to make sure that everybody that's working for the PI understands the norms and does not commit misconduct. But ultimately, everybody that's involved with the project gets tarnished if something happens, if any one individual, especially let's talk about the case of a scientific manuscript, where it's clear that if you're an author on a scientific manuscript that's been published, at some point during the process, you have verified whether or not you actually did or not. As far as the journal knows, you agreed that what was written and the data that were submitted to the journal are true and accurate. It's not quite legal, but basically every author on a scientific manuscript has stated that to the journal. I agree that everything that we're submitting is true, honest, to the best of my knowledge, etc. So then, later, if somebody identifies, hey, there's been something funny going on in the paper, then everybody's name that's on the paper, everybody gets tarnished. Right, so live together, die together. And so really it's everybody's job to police for misconduct, not just the PI. Main responsibility, yes. Okay. If there's anything fundamental to take away, this is probably it. Why should we care? So aside from public perception, the mad scientist stereotype, what happens if misconduct occurs? What can happen?
You destroy the reputation in the scientific world.
Okay, so that's most personal. You destroy your ability to get additional grants, probably to publish, it destroys your reputation, maybe your livelihood, maybe the university fires you or lays you off, whatever. Maybe you go to jail. It's happened. We'll talk about those cases.
Reduces funding as a whole for everyone.
Okay, so why does public perception count?
Of their voters.
And who controls the purse strings of the budget? Lawmakers. And who do they want to make happy? Their constituents. So if public, well, right, fair enough. So I saw the hand waving, yeah, maybe they do. It's all political, right? So unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, you be the judge. The public has a say to some extent in how much funding goes to the NIH, NSF, Bureau of Land Management, etc. And on the whole, if public mistrust of science starts drying up, sorry, that's a double negative. If public trust of science starts drying up, going away, then maybe we see fewer and fewer dollars going to research as a whole. That's bad for all of us. And so careers have been shattered, lower left picture. Misconduct. Probably all of you have heard, and probably all of you have a stance on, especially if any of you are parents, on immunizations. And the whole thing about do these shots increase the prevalence of autism?
Don't get me started.
Yeah, don't get me started either. Right, so fraud turned out after a decade or something, and this is a good case study because at the end of the class, everybody gets to pick a case study to talk about, a real life case study in negligence or fraud. This is one that often gets picked, right? Everybody has to pick a unique case, so one of you maybe will claim this, but yeah, so the papers that initially tried to show that there was a connection between immunizations and various types of illnesses were doctored. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry too.
It was bad,
Sorry
yeah.
too.
And then in the upper right corner, the Tuskegee Airmen, right?
Oh,
So informed consent, not giving syphilis to people and not telling them that you're giving them syphilis and you want to find out how it affects their health.
that's
So we spend a whole class on human subjects research and informed consent. And of course, those sorts of things bring down the public trust in science and reduce dollars, and then as dollars go down, everybody gets more stressed about publishing, and so it's maybe even a vicious cycle. So don't start down the road of misconduct.
Did you
Okay.
also argue that it hurts this particular field that you're publishing in?
Yeah, absolutely. So it can be narrow and it can be broad. Yeah. So, and in the case of autism and immunizations, clearly it's had a huge impact worldwide on, and of course the jury's still out. You can never prove a hypothesis, you can only disprove alternative hypotheses. So it may be that someday we find out that immunizations do exacerbate certain conditions, I don't know. Those studies haven't been done yet, they may not even have been theorized yet. I'm sort of an old man early in life. Kids are on my lawn out there. So we can skip the top two because we've kind of talked about them already, but what about punishments? What do you think? What sort of sanctions are reasonable to give to people that commit either misconduct or fraud? Negligence or, so you knew about it or you weren't sure?
Depends on the impact of your paper or what you actually did. So if it's just changing data points, then like jail isn't a thing. But if it's like what you said, you infect people with syphilis, or you actually have a wider impact, more people than just the paper, then jail is.
Fines, jail,
Yeah.
execution. There's a whole set. Never mind. It's a whole separate conversation. That's beyond bioethics.
That was like physics.
That's real ethics. Execution. Yeah, execution has to do with physics.
Well, I meant the physicists,
Oh,
the nuclear weapons.
right. Yep. So then there's the question of the scale of the offense. Well, so let's make it more personal. What about graduate students? It still depends. It still depends on the situation, but what's the lowest grade thing do you think could happen to a graduate student if they're found guilty of committing misconduct or fraud?
Their career pretty much going to go down the drain, especially, it depends on how big it is, but if word gets out that you're making out data, or if no one's going to want to work with
What
you.
sort of letter is your advisor going to write?
Yeah.
Because when you went down, did you tarnish your advisor's reputation, and how does that affect your mentor-mentee relationship? So that's not even a sanction. That's not even official punishment. That's just sort of splashback.
Change your major.
Change your... Yeah, go to a different field. A lot of people that get either guilty or innocent, something else that we can talk about, and we will talk about in just a few slides actually. What happens if people can accuse you of misconduct and you're found innocent? Your reputation still might get tarnished. So we'll see that in just a second.
Usually you usually get dropped, right? Straight away, it's one of the things that.
So do you get expelled? Do you get kicked out of your program? Do you get expelled from the university? Those are some significant to you, but still on the scale of things, rather minor ways for a university to deal with a case of fraud or misconduct. So yeah, financial sanctions, being put on academic probation, like there's some trivial, sort of relatively trivial minor things that can happen. So we have at Fresno State, as do most universities, colleges, and any agency that apply for and receive a grant, we have an academic policy on misconduct. And this spells out, so I suggest you read it. I've just put a couple screenshots in here. So you can just Google APM 510 on the Fresno State website, and it'll point you to this PDF of the academic policy. So we have our own definitions that you have to abide by of fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, right? So plagiarism, as long as you give credit, you're okay. As always, I mean, that's plagiarism, right? You use somebody else's ideas and you don't say where you got it from. In fact, I'm probably plagiarizing some photographs in this presentation. So, to make it really concrete, fabrication sounds like you make up data. Falsification sounds like that example, among other examples, of you delete some data points. And then you come up with a really good rationale for why you deleted those data points. There are actual cases where you can delete data points, and it's allowed. But there are some times when you can't just arbitrarily say, you know what, I just discovered that if I delete that data point, my p-value goes below 0.05. And I've done it before, I will admit it. I've never published afterwards, but I've tried it. You know, it's so tempting. I just got rid of that data point. Oh yeah, if I did get rid of that data point, it would be significant. And then you're really faced with a dilemma. Do I try to justify why I got rid of that data point, or do I just leave the data as they are? Don't be tempted. Okay. So more screenshots, and again, I'm just trying, I know this is data, lots of words, but just so you've got a resource now, remember all these PDFs I put, did I put this on Blackboard? I didn't.
No, you didn't, no.
If you ever notice that before class starts, tell me. I will post these slides on Blackboards afterwards as PDF on our course website. Usually you can download them before I start yapping, but I forgot to upload these before class today. So you'll have these are on Blackboard. But basically what this says, PHS, Public Health Service, is essentially the NIH to us. PHS is a slightly larger umbrella organization in the US government than the National Institutes of Health. But yeah, so basically it says the Fresno State policy applies to anybody who gets federal funds, especially the NSF and the NIH, two of the biggest federal funders of research. And last 3 lines. I don't know what it means, under the control of, mind control maybe. So this is when the interpretation is it's faculty and students and staff, technicians, and then it gets down to guest researchers or collaborators. So anybody on campus here, not if you collaborate with somebody else, they have to do their own institution's guidelines. Anybody who's physically here and has any sort of affiliation with Fresno State at all has to apply to the Fresno State manual. So I'm not going to go through the gory details of what happens when you get accused by fraud, but I just want to make a few points to clarify that you don't want this to happen to you. So it's a long process. It involves a lot of upper administration. If you think that you've observed any sort of misconduct, you are required essentially to report that to the Research Integrity Officer of the university, which is Tom McClanahan, who's the director of grants at Fresno State, essentially. So he's like a vice president. And it can't be anonymous. Because if they're going to investigate, they need to know they need to be able to talk to both sides. So if you suspect that misconduct is happening, you write a letter or call or go talk to Tom McClanahan. Then he tells the provost, another vice president, the vice president in charge of academics at Fresno State, provost. Okay, so then there's these hearings, so they convene a panel of supposedly impartial faculty, although you never know who's impartial. And they simply figure out whether or not there's enough evidence to warrant a full investigation. Then if there's a formal investigation, then everybody gets really pissed off because all these faculty that are already busy are doing other things. And so you just don't want to even go down this road to begin with. Scared straight is what we're doing here. And then basically at the end, if it goes into a full investigation, generate this report. And all the report concludes is whether or not research misconduct happened and who is responsible. So they don't suggest what should happen. They just basically tell Tom McClanahan, and the provost, was there fraud, yes or no, and who did it, who was responsible. So here are some outcomes. They're the ones we already discussed, the ones you'd expect. Personnel action may be taken. This is verbatim from the policy. I don't know what personnel action means, I can guess. Sounds like lingo for termination of the employment. Demotion, personnel action, legalese. Right. So you get sent to the Dean of Student Affairs, or maybe the graduate dean. Okay. The funding agencies then can say, so if the university finds that misconduct happened, the university has to inform the funding agencies. No shock, probably. So then the funding agencies decide whether or not they want to launch their own investigations, and if they want to withdraw funds, put sanctions on this university, not just you, but as a whole. And then also, Tom McClanahan, the research integrity officer, also has to tell any journals you published in, and then the journals can do investigations to decide whether or not any papers that you were currently or previously affiliated with should be retracted. And there's the kicker down at the bottom. Once your name's been dragged through the mud, if you're found not guilty, then Fresno State will take reasonable action to restore your reputation. Whatever the hell that means. You post something on a website that says, we found it. This party was not guilty. But, by then it's probably too late.
Can it be used by someone to drag your name through the mud? Is it common enough? Is it easy enough?
So yeah, if I don't like somebody, I could send a tip to Tom McClanahan and say, hey, I think this happened. I would not do that. That would be unethical.
But couldn't that bounce back on you then, since you have to give your name?
That's right. And maybe that's another reason why you're not allowed to give an anonymous tip. Try to reduce some of that potential. Because at least not in biology to my knowledge here, but at certain institutions, absolutely, I could totally see faculty within a department, sniping each other by accusing each other of doing things improperly. Here we're all collegial enough, I think, that we would just talk to each other about it if we thought that something weird was going on. And of course, that's usually the best approach, is to have an informal discussion, try to solve the problem before it becomes a bigger problem. So, as I said last week, the reason that I'm presenting this week is to give you an idea of what a typical presentation might look like. Next week we have group presentations from students, 2 students a week, talking about the same topic. So work together to do one presentation for the next few weeks, and then after that, single student presentations when we move into the talking about individual historical case studies of fraud or negligence, misconduct. And part of that, as it says in the syllabus, is to solicit faculty opinions. It doesn't have to be faculty, it doesn't have to be from Fresno State, it should be some sort of professional, so not mom or dad. Unless mom or dad happens to be a professional in science. It could be somebody you work for, it could be somebody at USDA, ARS, or anything like that. So I asked them this question. What are some reasons that scientists would fabricate or falsify data? And this is basically what they said. I'm not attributing any of these to either Dr. Lent or Dr. Rawat. Look cool in front of their friends. Actually, I think Dr. Rawat said that. I'm not sure that that's true, but all of these happen. And I also asked them who could be harmed by an act of scientific misconduct. Right. I think we've covered most of these already. Everybody was kind of a cop-out answer, but it's kind of true in a sense. But the bottom one we didn't talk about yet. So it is a financial and people impact that your publishing falsified data can have, because other research groups then will base their research on what you've published, and then they wind up spending probably federal funds, people's time, graduate student careers, undergraduate student careers, their own career, following a finding that's not really true. So just be a nice person and don't falsify or plagiarize, because you can lead a lot of other people astray. And then this is what they said about punishments. Their opinions. I don't know if you can actually permanently expel someone from science, but that would be kind of fun. Okay, this is the best question I asked them. Have they actually read the academic policy on misconduct? One had at some point, one had not. I still have not read the full thing. I mean, I did when I took those screenshots, but really understand it. It's been a couple of years since I read it. It hasn't been updated since then. But. So you could be better than some faculty here if you go read APM 510 and you're familiar with what it says. Teach your advisor some lessons about the academic policy manual. So for every student group presentation, not the individual ethical, historical case studies ones, but for the paired group presentations, do present your case study to 2 experts in science, say, and get their feedback on what that case study is. So here's the case study. As I said, don't read the case study out loud in front of the class when you present. Everybody should have come to class having read the case study. And by the way, does next week's group have your case study number ready to advertise?
Yes.
So what are we doing next week?
3.8.
Next week, so that's chapter 3. Boy, my handwriting's horrible. There we go. Case study 3.8, the back of chapter 3 in the textbook. So read that and come to class with opinions on what you think you would do. So we've got about 5 minutes left. This is the case study. So you can summarize, just don't read it verbatim when you present. So this is both research conduct and definitely some ethics. I mean, this is complicated. The interesting thing is a lot of these case studies from this book come from actual historical events. And such complicated things happen. So do you disclose somebody's potential misconduct to a potential new employer?
That was messed up.
Yeah.
I think it's the guilty until the innocent until proven guilty
Mm-hmm.
should probably, at least in my opinion, would stand. So even if I am 90% sure that what they did was guilty, unless the panel comes up and says, okay, then feel guilty, then I agree with delaying it personally because it is an ongoing investigation. So the idea of whether she's guilty or not, the potential employer should know.
Don't ask, don't tell. Sorry.
Okay, so innocent until proven guilty. Does that apply in this case?
For these investigations, are they unaware that there is an investigation going on for them?
Yes. So typically, if you're accused, then you're part of the investigation process. So that committee will interview you. They'll interview the person that accused you, and they'll interview as many other people as they think they need to get information about whether or not misconduct occurred.
So, but they know that they're being
Right.
accused.
They don't know who accused. You don't necessarily know who accused you. I'm not sure, actually. I'd have to reread that academic policy manual.
that before it happened.
Sure. So she might have applied for this job before she got accused. She might have asked for a recommendation before she got accused of misconduct.
So is the accusation made public within the group, or is it, like, should Sarah not have any knowledge of it?
I think
It says
So
that
she's on the
panel.
yeah, she's on the You're right. I had forgotten that step. Yeah, so Sarah is one of the 5 senior faculty members on the investigative panel. So then it's like, well, she's got inside information. She still doesn't necessarily know if the hammer's going to come down or not, guilty or not guilty. But at least she knows that this person's being investigated. So at the very least, is it worth telling a potential employer that she's being investigated?
She can't because she's bound to confidentiality.
Okay. So it'd be unethical to disclose something that's supposed to be confidential to a potential employer.
I think she just needs to decline to make any sort of recommendation. Because if you're waiting, she's already, they're gonna come back, have you received our emails? And you can't sit there and say, well, I'm waiting to find out if I can recommend her or not.
Awkward.
could she declare some sort of like maybe a conflict of interest in a way? I just come up and say, you know what, there's a specific reason.
Yeah, not disclose the reason.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
disclose the reason, just say I can't
Yeah.
write a recommendation for them.
Right. So what else would you want to say in that case? If you decline to write somebody a letter of recommendation, how do you word that email or memo or letter?
Couldn't you say due to confidentiality agreements?
But then the person that receives the email is wondering, wait, what sort of confidentiality situation are you in and you feel like you can't write them a letter?
Will come up another reason.
Is that ethical?
This time I cannot make a recommendation.
Right, so so it's something to consider. And at some point in your careers, you might be in the position of, you maybe already have written letters of recommendation from students that worked with you. If not yet, then probably at some point you will. Students have taken classes from you at some point. So you have to think really carefully when you tell a student, I'd rather not write a letter for you. If somebody contacts you about a student and you don't want to recommend them for whatever reason, you have to decide whether or not you're going to try to sit on the fence and not show your hand in terms of how you feel about somebody. This is particularly tricky.
You just hang up.
No reply.
I'm sorry, wrong number. So I don't have the answers necessarily, but yeah, it's just something to think about.
How,
I'm just kidding.
if she's proven guilty, how much is it advertised? Like how?
So how would the potential employer find out
Yeah.
if she was actually found guilty? Maybe then you send them an anonymous email. Hey, you should check out this place where I just learned that the person you were thinking about hiring was actually. So we'll go through this in a lot of detail in a couple of weeks, but briefly, one place you find this is the National Institutes of Health anyway. Every time one of their funded investigators gets found guilty, they publish in the Federal Register a short little article, basically. Every time someone's found guilty by the NIH. They publicize it. So it's public information. I don't know how Fresno State advertises, if they advertise it publicly, or if they only disclose it. I would assume it's not in the best interest of the university to publicly disclose it. But they would have to disclose it to certain entities like the funders and journals. I don't know how public it becomes. Good question. Okay, let's see. Out of time, so briefly, so next week we talked about mentoring. We've already heard which case study to read. That means that for next week also, the second student group should bring their case study number to announce next week. And finally, I'll update the syllabus. This is what I'm thinking currently. So because we've had an enrollment increase, I've had to reshuffle the schedule. I've tried to keep the first few groups the same, so there are not any immediate in the next 2 or 3 week changes. But this will be the new schedule. the dates of the weeks you can find on the syllabus if you don't know which date week 11 is. It's on the syllabus, back page. Do check these. If there is currently a conflict with scheduling, you're going to be at a conference or something the week I've assigned you, let me know. We'll work something out. It's not set in stone, it's just a proposal.
Where's the spring recess week? The spring recess week, we have no lecture that week, right?
So it's week 16, finals week, there's no class. So
I mean, the spring recess.
and then spring break isn't on here. So there's no class. We have class every week except for spring break, and we don't have class finals week.
Okay.
And spring break's not listed here. I don't know which week number it is, but I apparently skipped that week when I numbered the weeks. Yeah. So yes, do not come during spring break. I will not be here. I don't know where I'll be. On a beach somewhere drinking a pina colada and thinking about bioethics.